Welcome to NDTAC's N&D InFocus. I'm Nicholas Reed.
And I'm Alexandra Brawley.
Youth with disabilities represent a large portion of students educated in correctional facilities, but research suggests that not all students with disabilities receive the special education and related services to which they are entitled. Research also shows, however, that providing students with disabilities in correctional facilities with the free appropriate public education, or FAPE, to which they are entitled under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, facilitates their successful reentry into the school, community, and home. FAPE also helps students with disabilities to ultimately lead successful lives as adults. Today, NDTAC is continuing our INFocus programs, exploring the Correctional Education Guidance Package, released in 2014 by the U.S. Departments of Education and Justice. In today's program, we'll focus on the package's Dear Colleague letter on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act for students with disabilities in correctional facilities. We will discuss the provisions of the letter, as well as the major challenges that juvenile secure care settings face in providing FAPE to students with disabilities. We'll also highlight some jurisdictions that exemplify the recommended practices in the letter.
To get us started today, we're pleased to be joined by Michael Uden, the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services at the U.S. Department of Education, and Joe Gagnon, Associate Professor of Special Education at the University of Florida. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. To help us get a better sense of this issue, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the prevalence of youth with disabilities within juvenile secure care. Just how many youth are we talking about? Joe, can we start with you?
Sure. So if we take a look at the general population of youth in schools in America and compare that to youth that are incarcerated in correctional facilities, generally speaking, if you take a look at, for example, kids with disabilities, in the general population, you have about 8.5% of students in schools are classified as special education. In contrast, when you look at juvenile corrections, estimates tend to be a bit on the low side because there's difficulties with child find in juvenile corrections oftentimes. But the most recent estimate is that there's 40% of youth that are classified with a disability. If we break that down, there's more students, well, let me start again. If we break that down, there's an overrepresentation of students with emotional disturbance in juvenile corrections. In the general population, only about 6.2% of youth have disabilities. But if we look at juvenile correctional facilities, about half of all youth that are incarcerated have emotional disturbances. The other very prevalent disability classification in juvenile corrections is kids with learning disabilities, and it actually is rather similar in terms of the overall population of students that have learning disabilities. If you take a look at students that have disabilities, about 40% of those have learning disabilities. And in juvenile corrections, if you take a look at the kids that have disabilities, it's about 38.6%.
And Michael, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just, briefly, this is clearly an area, we believe that more research and stronger data collection is needed. I know that there was a study back in 2005 that showed about a third of students in the system have disabilities, but that from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, that actually can swing from as little as 9% to as high as 78%. So again, just to reiterate, right, this is just clearly an area where more research and data collection is needed.
So we know that the percentages of youth with disabilities within secure care settings may vary, regardless of how many there are. These youth have some unique needs as students. Joe, what do we know about these needs?
Sure. I want to mention a couple of different areas in terms of the needs of incarcerated youth. First, if we take a look at academic and vocational issues, if we look at behavioral needs, then there's mental health needs, and then issues surrounding transition that I think are a bit more than what perhaps a student in a regular public school might need and experience. From the academic and vocational aspect, we know that students that are incarcerated commonly have problems, particularly in reading and math. They are about 2 to 3 grade levels behind their non-incarcerated peers in both reading and math. If we take a look at the fact that there's a very high percentage of kids with disabilities, and particularly emotional disturbance and learning disabilities in juvenile corrections, it's also relevant that those two groups of students with ED and LD commonly perform poorly on state assessments. And so you have students that are incarcerated that have a long history of academic failure, and they come into a facility, and most of them have very few academic credits. So you're left in a situation where you've got a high percentage of kids with disabilities. You've got a high percentage of kids that have academic failure. From a behavioral perspective, again, realizing that there's a high percentage of kids with emotional disturbance, and sort of by virtue of that disability classification, they've had a long history with behavior problems. Many of the kids that are incarcerated have a history of suspension, expulsion, many behavioral problems throughout their academic career. And so juvenile correctional facilities are faced with a student population that has many academic needs, and then they have a real high level of behavioral needs. And I'll just mention one other issue quickly, and that is, transition is an aspect of any kid with a disability as they move into adolescence. And transition is particularly important for kids with disabilities and kids that are incarcerated, because you've got the transition from the facility out into school, the community, the workplace, and you have the transition ultimately from school out into post-school activities. And so the students who, when they leave the facility, if they go back to their community and go back to their school, and they're actually engaged in continued learning, engaged in working, engaged in their community, then there's a lower chance that they'll recidivate. And so the transition, how we get those kids from a facility out into the community, necessarily needs to begin when they enter the facility.
Michael, do you care to elaborate on any of that?
Sure. I mean, that was a great and thorough answer. And I agree with a lot of what you said, Joe. Just to particularly around the transition and reentry issues, I think are so critically important, and IDEA provides great opportunities to support kids in their transition and reentry back into their communities and their schools. But just to note, right, like the whole purpose of IDEA is to provide, kids with disabilities the special ed and related services they need to meet their unique needs. So that's the actual stated purpose of IDEA, in order that they make progress in the general curriculum alongside students without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. So we should always be keeping that in mind, that is in fact the purpose of IDEA. We know, however, that for most students in facilities, access to individualized services, access to their IEPs is an issue, as is access to rigorous academic content. And just to, echo Joe's remarks, right? I mean, we know that many of these kids, do require services to address their social, emotional, and behavioral needs.
Now, we know that providing high-quality education within juvenile secure care settings can pose challenges for agencies and facilities, but I would imagine this is even more difficult when we look at students with disabilities. Joe, what has your research shown to be some of the biggest challenges these settings face in meeting the needs of youth with disabilities?
Well, I want to go back to sort of their main area of needs in terms of academic, vocational, behavioral, mental health, and transition, and sort of respond to that in terms of how facilities are typically addressing needs in those main areas of need. In terms of academics and curriculum and instruction, we know that the from my own research that the curriculum is often disconnected from both public school and from what kids are expected to know on state assessments. There may be in facilities, even courses missing, so that it is actually impossible for a student to get a high school diploma due to the lack of courses being offered. So I think there needs to be an evaluation and an alignment of curriculum in juvenile corrections with regular public schools. However, to supplement that rather than supplant, it's clear that many of these kids that have so few credits, who are in their mid-teens, may need some additional types of supports and activities, including vocational education. There are a few facilities here and there that do offer some types of vocational education, but I think it's one of those things that right now it's sort of hit and miss. So I think overall, the curriculum and adding in vocational, really an organized vocational program is important. In terms of instruction, in juvenile corrections, we have many well-meaning teachers that I think try hard in difficult situations. The research that I've done, though, shows that particularly math teachers and reading teachers are not using what we know is evidence-based in terms of their instructional approaches. And there are some instructional approaches that are what we might consider best available evidence. They don't quite meet the rigor of evidence-based, but oftentimes teachers are not using those either. And so that's going to require a very comprehensive, ongoing professional development program that right now, if you take a look at the teachers in juvenile corrections, typically they're isolated from public schools, they're isolated from their colleagues, and they don't participate in the professional development of public schools. So I think that's something that's going to have to be addressed. From a behavioral aspect, we know it's common knowledge, and many researchers have mentioned this, that there's a reactive, a punitive, and exclusionary approach to student behavior in juvenile corrections. And isolation is often used, and what we know is that reactive, punitive, and exclusionary approaches do not work. And there has been a push toward the use of positive behavior intervention and support in juvenile corrections. A multi-tiered approach to student behavior would go a long way to dealing with some of these issues in a proactive and positive manner that will actually promote appropriate student behavior. And then lastly, in terms of transitional services, I've been in facilities throughout the country, and oftentimes transition services, what I see is you have a dynamic administrator, or you have a dynamic office assistant who contacts public schools, who has relationships with individuals in public schools, or calls them tirelessly, and that's the way that they get records. And I think when you remove, or one of those people leaves, then the system falls apart. And there are a number of facilities that don't have such a dynamic person to rely on. And so ultimately, the idea of transition services and record exchange, it needs to be part of a formalized, monitored process that will allow a specific plan for record exchange, for example, that is not contingent upon a few hardworking individuals, but it's an institutionalized approach that is monitored by the state Department of Juvenile Justice, whatever the case may be, the local school system, but somehow there has to be this formalized process that is continually monitored.
And Michael, what's the Department of Education's take on this? What challenges are you and your colleagues working to help agencies and facilities overcome?
Obviously we know that, most facilities are aware of their responsibility to implement, to secure, and then implement the student's IEP. I mean, this is really the most important critical step is getting that IEP quickly to ensure that the kids continue to get their services, the services that they need. As Joe said, right, many, a dynamic, educator or administrator in the facility will have a great relationship with the school district and they can facilitate that. But I think Joe was talking about it on the back end. On the front end, it's making sure that the IEP is available quickly, and that the services are there, are implemented in accordance with the IEP. So we also know, on the other hand, that many facilities have pretty significant challenges, not only securing the IEP, but going forward and implementing the IEP. We know that a lot of jurisdictions struggle with concerns about FERPA, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. They're not sure if they have the authority to transfer records. So to that end, we've actually issued a short myth-buster on FERPA to clarify how and when schools and JJ facilities can actually share student records. But we're also really concerned that there may be students in facilities that have disabilities but have not yet been identified and therefore not getting any of the services that they would be entitled to under IDA. That's under the child fine. So, really strongly believe that staff ultimately need much more significant training on the child fine procedures and must be prepared to participate in the development of the IEP that support the kids' needs.
Well, I think that's a great segue to the Dear Colleague letter focused on IDA. Michael, we'll talk about what's in the letter in a moment. But first, can you tell us why the Department of Education and Justice included this letter in the Correctional Education Guidance Package? Why is this particular issue so important?
Yeah, sure. So, just as for anecdotal purposes, right, my visit with Secretary Duncan, Attorney General Holder, to the Northern Virginia Detention Center, it reinforced to me how important this Dear Colleague was for many of these kids that we met in this facility. This was actually their last best chance. They were not succeeding at home. They were not succeeding at school. They had, in this facility, they had opportunities and relationships. Every single one of the kids we met with spoke about, connections and caring adults that really paid attention and supported their needs. And the self-centered, the student-centered IEP process just seemed so robust. It just, again, reinforced to me how critical it was to put out this guidance, which was essentially, frankly, a reminder of what the federal laws are around supporting kids in juvenile justice facilities. The package as a whole, it reviews 3 significant federal laws impacting students with disabilities in JJ facilities. One of the letters reviewed the IDEA, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then there was a separate letter on the civil rights of students in JJ facilities reviewing Section 504 of the Rehab Act and Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Between the 2 letters, we've outlined state and local obligations, again, to reinforce what those obligations are. That's really the purpose of this letter, to reinforce what state and local obligations are, not only to students with disabilities served under IDA, but again, for those who qualify for services under Section 504. And just, further, the IDA letter was also a natural follow-up to a statement of interest that Ed and the Department of Justice filed in 2014 in a suit against Contra Costa County. And you may remember in that case, there were 3 students with disabilities confined to juvenile hall. They were subjected to solitary confinement and denied access to special ed services. There were a couple of agencies responsible for the provision of FAPE, free appropriate public education, to these 3 students: the county, which was responsible for the juvenile hall, and the LEA, the local educational office, which operated juvenile court hall. And FAPE wasn't provided, and we wanted it clear that under IDA, neither agency could escape their responsibility to provide a free, appropriate public education to kids with disabilities. Second, we wanted to clarify that under the ADA, that public entities must implement reasonable modifications to their policies, their practices, and procedures to prevent youth with disabilities from being placed in solitary confinement due to disability-related behaviors. And then in the Correctional Ed Guidance Package, we wanted to further clarify a central point we made in that statement of interest. We wanted it clear that, in general, students with disabilities in correctional facilities retain all of the rights afforded them under the IDEA.
And so, with that background, can you briefly walk us through the major components of the Dear Colleague letter? We have the letter linked on our website, but just so our listeners are aware of what it covers.
Absolutely. So, to the points I was just making, right, like ensuring that everybody understands that there is this concept of shared responsibility for FAPE, that every agency at any level of government that is involved in the provision of special ed and related services to students in correctional facilities must ensure the provision of FAPE, even if other agencies share that responsibility. States must have interagency agreements or other methods for ensuring interagency coordination in place so that it's clear which agency or agencies are responsible for providing or paying for services necessary to ensure FAPE. We thought it was very important to lay out again what the law says about state educational agencies' responsibilities, including the fact that SEAs must exercise general supervision over all educational programs for students with disabilities in correctional facilities. So again, that's part of their responsibilities under general supervision under IDEA. And they must establish and maintain qualifications to ensure that personnel providing special ed and related services are appropriately trained and prepared. Public school special ed teachers in correctional facilities must be highly qualified as defined by IDEA, and that related services personnel and paraprofessionals must meet state qualifications for those personnel. We also, highlighted the requirements around child find. Again, this is a particularly thorny and difficult issue, and states must have child find policies and procedures in place to identify, to locate, and evaluate students who are in correctional facilities who may have a disability under IDA and are in need of special ed and related services, and regardless of the severity of the disability and consistent with the state's child find and eligibility standards. At the heart of IDA is the entitlement to free, appropriate public education, FAPE, in the least restrictive environment. We want to make sure we remind folks of their obligations to provide FAPE in the least restrictive environment. So when a student with an IEP transfers to the correctional facilities in the same state, in the same school year, the new public agency must provide the student with FAPE through services comparable in the student's IEP from the previous public agency until the previous agency's IEP is adopted or until the new agency develops and implements a new IEP. IEP teams or placement teams must make individualized placement decisions and may not routinely place all students with disabilities in classes that include only students with disabilities, even if this means creating placement options or using other arrangements. Public agencies must comply with IDA's secondary transition requirements, as we talked about earlier, to facilitate students' movement from secondary ed in the correctional facility to the appropriate post-school activities. And one final point I want to raise is around discipline, and the discipline procedures apply as well. A student with a disability who violates a code of student conduct is entitled to the protections in IDEA discipline procedures afforded to all students with disabilities. These protections apply regardless of whether the student who violates a code of student conduct is subject to discipline in the facility or removed to restricted settings, such as confinement to the student cell or lockdown. So I think that's pretty much the essence of the Dear Colleague.
So now that we know what's in the letter, what are your thoughts on how agencies, facilities, schools, and others can best use the letter? Michael, let's start with you.
I appreciate that question, actually. So the letter really is designed as a reminder to state officials of their obligations under IDEA. And so first and foremost, getting that information out and making sure folks fully understand what their obligations are. But at the same time, the letter has enough detail to be a guide for training local educational juvenile justice officials as well as facility administrators on the various aspects of IDEA. It doesn't contain all of the information they need, for example, the details of what interagency agreements or child find procedures look like. Those will vary from state to state. But again, we believe it's a strong starting point for those who need access to understand what the law requires. We're also working closely with our colleagues at the Department of Justice on ways to promote state-level collaboration between our Title I, our Part D directors, our directors of special ed, and our JJ specialists who receive funding under the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. So we hope this letter, as well as the rest of the guidance package, provides officials with a useful tool to initiate conversations with their natural partners.
And Joe, what are your thoughts on how those in the field can get the most out of the letter?
Yeah, I think the Dear Colleague letter would be a great resource for facilities across the U.S. One thing that I found in my own research is that facility administrators are actually commonly unaware of IDEA regulations. And so, I think some of the things that are not occurring, this is a really good reminder, or even perhaps their first introduction to some of the regulations and requirements. And if you take a look at the Dear Colleague letter, these issues are at the forefront of what happens or why lawsuits are brought against facilities. And so I think it's a great way to just get an idea of what are the main issues here. And I would say that there's really 4 steps that every facility should follow. The first thing is to set up a team with their own teachers, administrators, jurisdiction, school district, state people, and set up a team that can start to go through and address these issues. Now, in order for them to really understand where they stand, I think that every facility should have an external program evaluation. And I've seen many facilities do this. It's not always from a qualified professional, but really facilities need someone who is competent in the regulations, the IDEA regulations, to actually evaluate them on those, on the aspects that are included in the Dear Colleague letter. And the third step that I would say is that every facility should come up with an implementation plan. And I think that's really important because I can see from my experience in facilities throughout the country that any facility is going to look at the Dear Colleague letter and get really worried and say, oh my God, we need to do this, we need to do this and this and this. And I think the risk is becoming overwhelmed and then sort of frozen because of the immensity of the task. And I think that a clear implementation plan where they take a realistic steps to address any of these issues, right, that at their facility that are problematic is going to be a thoughtful way to really be proactive and not get to the situation where there ends up being a lawsuit. And then once they have this plan and it's reviewed by the team to actually implement it and to have, again, a plan and a formal system for both internal and external monitoring. Because I think one of the things that I've seen in my research in facilities is that there is a lack of oversight and then there's a lack of accountability. And I think that any implementation plan is going to necessitate very clear and ongoing plan for monitoring.
Well, that certainly provides a great blueprint for using the letter. Assistant Secretary Uden, Professor Gagnon, I want to thank you both so much for joining us today and helping set the stage on this issue. That's Michael Uden, the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services at the U.S. Department of Education, and Joe Gagnon, an Associate Professor of Special Education at the University of Florida.
Thank you, Alexandra. Now that we know more about the scope of the issue and about how the federal government is focused on it, we want to find out what good practices look like on the ground level. The state of Nebraska is one state taking a comprehensive, coordinated approach to meeting the educational and related needs of all students with disabilities educated in juvenile secure care facilities. Joining us today to talk about just what it takes to make this happen are guests who represent some key pieces in the Nebraska equation. First, at the state level, Jean Heaston is a program specialist for the Special Education Office at the Nebraska Department of Education. Joining her is colleague Pat Frost, who is the state's Title I Part D coordinator as well as a Title I Part A consultant. Jean, Pat, thank you both so much for joining us. We heard from Assistant Secretary Uden that a major focus of the IDEA Dear Colleague letter is on reasserting state education agencies' responsibilities to coordinate the provision of FAPE and special education services for youth with disabilities in secure care. How is the Nebraska Department of Education doing that?
Well, actually, in Nebraska, the Nebraska statute has the Department of Ed overseeing the special ed services, and the way it's handled with regulations and standards comes from a document called Rule 51, and that gives all of the regulations and standards for the district to follow through and cooperative agencies to follow through.
And Jean, as I understand it, Rule 51 also outlines the specific responsibilities of school districts and service agencies when it comes to the education of youth with disabilities in secure care settings. What are those responsibilities?
School districts have the responsibility of identifying students, and then if a student is placed outside of that district, they have the responsibility of following through with that student and making sure that they are receiving their free appropriate public education, or FAPE as we call it. So we really work primarily with school districts in the implementation of IDEA and the provision of FAPE. So that is one of the main things that we do. We really do make an effort to keep the school district in the flow of the activity. We realize that in some cases we have students who have been out of school or that have moved around a lot, so it sometimes is a challenge to identify who's the resident school district, but we make every effort to make that happen, and I know school districts do also. This happens when you have students who are wards of the state or something like that, where they can be moved out of what was their original home district and just being able to follow through with them.
And in what ways does NDE ensure school districts and service agencies are meeting their obligations to students with disabilities? Are there specific oversight or assessment processes in place?
We do have at the Department of Education a process where we do have an approval of service agencies that so they can get what we call a state rate, and primarily that is not saying, looking at them in a monitoring sense and saying whether or not they have all of the special education requirements. But if they are going to be contracting, and that goes to the school district level to contract with that agency, and they need to have what we call a state rate, and that's what is the amount of money that's reimbursable for the services that they're providing, that the districts would get reimbursement for. We do monitor school districts on a 5-year cycle, and we look at all parts of the kinds of services that they are providing. We also monitor school service agencies on a 3-year cycle and look at similar issues, especially we look at whether or not the school district is carrying through in being responsible for the IEP, individual education plan, and different things like that.
Another important aspect of ensuring high-quality education for students with disabilities educated in secure care that comes from the Dear Colleague letter is that these students are included in the general state assessments alongside their peers in community schools and those without disabilities. Is that true in Nebraska?
We do have students included in the state assessment. There again, that's why it's important to have the school district involved in the process, because they are ultimately responsible for ensuring that the district is including all students in the statewide assessment. And so they work with different facilities, and make sure that they can get those students assessed in line every year with how they're doing it internally.
So looking at another important piece of the Dear Colleague letter, how does NDE and in turn the school districts and service agencies ensure that students with disabilities are served by teachers and other education personnel who are qualified to meet their unique needs?
From the state perspective, Rule 51 spells out qualified personnel requirements, and also because the funding comes from the state for special ed, teachers would have to be fully qualified in that area for a facility receive funding for that teacher.
We've had some questions about the whether teachers have to be special education teachers. And if you are providing special education services, you need to meet the requirements of Rule 51 on the section that talks about personnel, that you need to have the right certification to be providing those services for there to be reimbursement. So there is a follow through with that, and how they meet that, whether they contract with an outside person to come in and provide those services, if that is what they need to do, or whatever the situation presents itself, they need to find a way to make sure that those services are being provided by someone who's qualified under IDEA and under Rule 51, Section 10 to provide those services.
I want to bring in a few others joining us from Nebraska today into the conversation. Scott Gregory is the principal at the Geneva School, located at the Geneva Youth Rehabilitation Treatment Center, which is the state long-term facility for girls. He's joined by Randy Farmer, who is the director of the Pathfinder Project at the Lancaster County Youth Services Center, a short-term detention center, and Dave Erb, the principal and special education teacher at the Northeast Nebraska Juvenile Services Center, another of the state's detention facilities. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. To this point, we've been hearing from your state colleagues how NDE oversees and coordinates FAPE and special education within juvenile secure care settings, and I want to see how this translates at the facility level. Going back to the question of how facilities ensure staff are qualified and certified to serve students with disabilities, how is that responsibility met within your respective facilities? Dave, can we start with you?
Okay. As far as our rural detention center, we just make sure that we have as far as our special education students, we make sure we have a special education teacher on our staff. At any one time, we don't have a huge number of special education kids, but just having a special education teacher and then all the teachers aware of what the needs are from each IEP is pretty much how we stay on top of that.
In Geneva, we are a Rule 10 special purpose agreement school. So the bare minimum, I think, is 80% of teachers have to be certified in their area. I think I'm hovering around 92, 95%. So accreditation is very important and is something that we value. We have a lot of veteran teachers who are certified in their area and are not teaching, they're not an English teacher teaching PE, but, that type of thing. So that's something that we really mind and care about quite a bit. I have one SPED teacher on staff and have two other teachers out of 11 who are working towards an endorsement in special education and want to do some work in that area.
Here at the Pathfinder program, we have 3 special ed teachers out of our 8 special ed certified teachers out of our 8 certified teachers on staff. We do see a disproportionately high rate of special ed students through our interim program at a short-term detention facility. We run about twice the rate of a typical classroom that you would see in the public schools. And we do provide all of the special ed information to teachers on an immediate basis. We have a live document that teachers keep open on their desk for attendance purposes. And within that is an area with special ed needs addressed specifically for the classroom teacher to know about. We do have certified teachers in each of the core subject areas. Nebraska traces credits to the class, to the certification of the teacher, and so for district purposes, that's very important. We do get all the support and assistance you could ask for from the school district. If we have any special needs for something, They're always willing to accommodate. And they come out and do trainings for us upon request, or sometimes they'll contact us and say, hey, we've got this going on. Would you like to have somebody come out and talk to your group about it? So it's a real advantage to be connected so closely with the school district.
And is training and ongoing professional development available for teachers to help them better serve youth with disabilities within the facilities?
Well, what I've done is we have educational service units, and the one by us is very gracious to us. When it comes to the state facilities, they don't necessarily have to help you out, but ours have been very gracious. We had Nancy Meyer, who is a very, very important person in special education in Nebraska. We brought her in to do a training and to look at IEPs and how you do the modifications and different ways that you would handle it. The teachers brought their lesson plans and tests and assignments in, and then she would work with them on how you would change certain things to benefit the student to do that. Also, there's also special education conferences, that type of thing. The teachers sign up for professional development, throughout the year. They have 3 professional days that they can utilize to that. More can be granted if it's necessary, and it's not something we say no to a lot. So we do really work with them to improve their skills in delivery of teaching and to improve in teaching of the content.
At the Pathfinder program, we have access to all of the staff development that's provided by Lincoln Public Schools and allowed to pick and choose what's applicable to what we do. They recognize that our world's a little bit different. They do regularly have trainings for some of the other programs and facilities within the district. We have a number of alternative schools and programs that are part of Lincoln Public Schools, all which are really, really great programs run by some very interesting people, and we spend a lot of time comparing notes back and forth. We're also, at the Pathfinder program, our staff here are involved at a national level with the National Partnership for Juvenile Services, and a couple of our staff members and myself have presented a number of times at national conferences. And we also have a very close relationship with the Correctional Education Association, another national education organization for youth and adults in confinement. And we've presented at their conference as well. So we've got a lot of good connections out there that we're able to tap into when we have specific questions or specific needs, and that's been a tremendous benefit to us.
One thing the OHP, the Out-of-Home Placement Committee, did a couple of years ago was having a reading cadre where teachers from the different facilities were able to get training, and then a reading coach would come out and work with them and observe and answer any questions they had. It was a series of 5 trainings, and we had some special ed funding from the state for that. And we anticipate that form of training will continue in the reorganized form that the OHP committee will take on.
Now, obviously an important aspect of best serving youth with disabilities, regardless of where they're educated, is knowing who is in need of special education services and what each student's needs might be. Can you talk a little bit about the procedures for screening and assessing youth?
Service agencies are not equipped to be doing any identification of students. So let's say if a service agency got an individual in there and they had some suspect that the child might have a disability, they are required to go back to the school district and to involve them in that process of potentially doing some evaluation of the student and possible identification for special education services. This is truly the function of the school district if you're going to do any kind of identification. That's not to say that these facilities, are not possibly doing some screening, but the assessing that they're doing should not lead to identification under IDEA unless they're working with the school district to complete that process.
So with the responsibility for identifying youth in need of special education and developing IEPs in the hands of the school districts, I would imagine it's very important for facilities to work closely with the districts to get the IEPs and understand the needs of these students as they enter facilities. So how do facilities work with school districts on this?
Okay. Well, a lot of times we will receive copies of the IEPs and then we look at the expiration date. We've had 2 girls who came in within the last month. Both of those IEPs expire. One we've renewed with the local school district, and sometimes the kid hasn't darkened the door for about a year or so, because they are just in and out of different schools and in and out of different placements. It changes up considerably, and Randy can tell you that too. So when that happens, that presents a lot of issues. But if you call the home school of record, they will oftentimes be very gracious and help you out and do it. So they've been good to work with in that regard. The second kid, we're presently working that out, sending the paper around to get signatures, that type of thing. So finding the IEPs isn't an issue. Renewing is something that takes a little legwork, a lot of phone tag, but it's something that can be done as well. So it takes a lot of cooperation and a lot of, reaching out and touching base with people. It's something that we've done more. And as you kind of operate in certain circles, you kind of know familiar names and faces, and that's been a huge help as well.
It's a little bit different here because we're such a short-term facility, and the kids tend to be involved in some pretty traumatic events of their life when they come here. So we're real hesitant to make a judgment on a very short-term stay. But we will notify schools if we have concerns, and we do a reading and a math assessment on every student that comes in. And a big part of what we do is gathering together all of their information and their records into one complete file, because so many of our kids have been in multiple placements in multiple states at times. They've really been out there just wandering around, and oftentimes that's one of the best services we can provide is get all their information together, get a good look at who they are, and then make a recommendation to a school if we have concerns. We have done IEP meetings and all of that type of work here. We can have people come and do it in our visiting area. We do have a SPED teacher who is our intake processing person, so they're very aware of what to look for and what to keep teachers aware of, but also when it's time to contact the schools or other individuals to get involved with a student.
As far as our dealings with the IEPs and stuff, schools are very, very good to work with as far as getting the IEPs to us on a timely manner for the short time that we do work with kids. And we also, it seems like we've done a lot of renewals over the phone just because our schools are so far away of the students that we work with.
So continuing to look at the components of the Dear Colleague letter, how are youth with disabilities integrated into the regular classrooms and program of instruction? We know how important it is for students with disabilities to be educated in the least restrictive environments as possible alongside their peers without disabilities.
Well, I would say in Geneva, when they're classified, they start school basically after 2 weeks, after they do the orientation process and learn how the facility works and how the treatment program operates. We try to mimic as best we can the regular public school setting. We kind of operate I would say it's the industrial school model, but because there's an 8-period day, they're regular subject teachers, and then they go to and from classes with girls from different groups, not necessarily their own assigned group, for 50 minutes a day. And typically, last year we had a high number of kids that were identified with IEPs and who did have I want to say some programs with DD services and that type of deal. We have them in the regular education classrooms. We do have a SPED teacher who works with them 1 or 2 periods a day, kind of as needed. She does some Apex classes online with them and that type of thing. So as we don't have any junior high kids, we've been able to utilize her more in that route, in that kind of program to work with. We are looking at doing more of a in-class support type of network where the kids would be in there and then she would be in the classroom with them, helping them take notes or giving them different study ideas and doing that. That's one change that we are looking towards to implement this next year. But typically they, other than 1 or 2 class periods with her, they are fully integrated in there as well. So it's not an issue of what I want to say, keeping a kid in one room the entire duration of the day. they more than function the majority of the time with the other youth. And our program is so tightly run, and there's a lot of structure. It's very beneficial.
What we do is we break down every IEP that we get. We talk about it as a group of teachers, what each student needs. We discuss which type of curriculum we're going to offer to the student, because we've got probably 3-4 different curriculum options that we can offer our kids. And just depending on what our students' need is, we move forward from that. So we really look at what each individual needs, and they're fully integrated in our classrooms as well. So.
And I would say the same thing that Dave's saying. We have multiple options that we can use with students depending on what their specific needs are. The county actually decides the makeup of each classroom based upon security level, not academic ability. So all of our classrooms are mixed ability, and all of our classrooms have a constant turnover of new students as kids come and go from the facility. So what we have in terms of special ed is that we're already differentiating within the classroom. It's already a smaller classroom size. And then our special education teachers have built into their schedules periods during the day when they are free to either go in and assist in the classroom, or if there's special things, needs that have to be met outside of the classroom, they're available to provide those services. But typically they are integrated right in with the regular classroom. And a lot of the things that are required are just a part of the structured classroom that we run here on a typical daily basis anyways. But any of the special needs can be met. And if we need something from the district, if we need a speech language person or something like that, we can always request that, and actually can get that typically on the same day we request it.
Another area the Dear Colleague letter talks about is discipline. As we heard from our guests earlier, many times youth with disabilities can demonstrate challenging behaviors that disrupt learning and may violate facility behavior expectations. So how do facilities discipline youth with disabilities, ensuring that the sanctions and responses are not disproportionately more severe for these youth?
Well, I know in our facility here at the Pathfinder program, we have to work very closely with the detention officers. Safety and security is the first priority here. But our motto is that we will educate you anywhere at any time in this building, no matter what your circumstance happens to be at that time. We always advocate to get the student back into the regular classroom as soon as possible. But we don't always have the decision-making part of that process in our hands. So whatever we can do to provide the best educational services, we do, regardless of where the student is. If we know something that we can share appropriately that will help in that decision-making process, then we're always, a positive advocate for the student. It's a delicate balance there, but we have such a good relationship with our officers here that they understand that we know things about their behaviors in the academic environment that are different from their behaviors on the housing unit or in recreation or some other time. So they tend to support us very, very well and take our input very seriously. And we are strong advocates about the educational needs of all our students, but especially the special education students that we have in our facility.
In Geneva, we've done a lot of work in that regard. We used to be under the Department of Corrections and moved to Health and Human Services. We have a very distinctive culture here. The number of people who have handcuffs is very limited. The teachers don't have radios, that type of thing. We really try, like I said, to mimic what a regular public school looks like in that regard. And not just with SPED kids, but with any kids, whenever a disciplinary issue comes up, you have to look at the context of why it occurred. If a family visit did not happen, a relative passed away, that type of thing, we do look at circumstances and deal with those accordingly, that type of deal. Some kids are impulsive, or some have anger and authority issues, that type of deal. the big thing is, we do have what we call MRIs, or minor rule infractions. And if you were to put in quotes, write a kid up, that's where you sit down with them and you'd process with them as to the behavior that is concerning, and then come up with ways to handle things better in the future. It could be completing a worksheet on anger. It could be coming up with a list of 3 coping skills you'll use. It could be that you have them keep a journal for a week on how they've handled different issues and that type of thing. And so it becomes a teaching moment. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort. That can be perhaps more frustrating maybe on the staff side of things, because you are asked to do a lot, and we do ask the employees to carry quite a burden and then some to do it. But it is a distinctive culture, and we have refined our due process and discipline rules to really kind of emphasize the teaching of the skills, and in moving towards evidence-based programming and incorporating evidence-based program discipline into our program. And more of those changes are coming down the pipe as well.
Discipline in our facility, we try to discipline and hold all kids accountable pretty much evenly, whether they have a disability or not. But in dealing with some of our students, our youth that are with us, our staff are aware of their abilities or disabilities, and it's considered when we do discipline. So each student is treated differently in that regard as well, I would say.
Well, I want to conclude this conversation with one of the major themes that emerged in the previous discussion with Assistant Secretary Uden and Professor Gagnon, and that's the area of transition. We heard how critical it is for secure care facilities to properly plan for a youth's reentry back into the community so that they can have success after they leave. And I understand that Nebraska, as a state, has recently shifted the way transition and reentry is handled for all youth. I want to bring a final guest into this conversation. Mark Mason is currently the reentry program specialist for the Nebraska Administrative Office of the Courts on the probation side. He previously worked as a transition liaison to the state's youth rehabilitation treatment centers, so he knows transition pretty well. Welcome, Mark. Can you tell us about the change in how Nebraska is now handling transition and how, in particular, students with disabilities are served by the process?
So there's been a shift. Roughly right about 2 legislative sessions ago, 3 legislative sessions ago, there was a bill passed that shifted some of the responsibilities of Health and Human Services over to probation. So during that time, some of the things that were taking place then when I was a YRTC transition liaison now look a little different, where a lot of the youth were state wards, and so they had a caseworker with Health and Human Services and the parent involved, both. I don't know if I would say equally involved, but both definitely needing to be a part of the process as youth re-entered into the community from the YRTCs, which is out-of-home placement, and then getting them started in school and kind of what home looked like. Now, with supervision through probation, the parents, we by and large work with the parents. Now, we are, of course, working with the schools. Mr. Gregory, who's on the phone here with us, and then his counterpart in Kearney, we work with both of them to try to get a sense for where the student's at. And then once a youth is ready to re-enter the community, we primarily work with the parents who are making all the educational decisions and then are responsible for educational rights at that point too.
And Scott, Randy, and Dave, turning to you, how are you all now working with probation around transition for all students, but particularly those with disabilities?
Sure. What happens is they're under the Department of Probation and technically are considered intensive supervised probation, even when they're with us at the facility. When they complete all of their treatment outcomes, a 60-day notice goes out, and the 60-day notice says, on X day, this kid will be out in the community, and these services are lined up, for counseling, school reentry, that type of deal. More often than not, they will get a furlough to go into the community to register for classes. I will get basically transcript requests really quick as soon as the 60-day goes out. When the kid hits the door, everything is on its way and has arrived, and we give a copy to the students as well. They do take a careers inventory test from our guidance counselor, and they do leave with a pamphlet with contact information and that type of thing as well. There is a reentry hearing that is set up on some nice program called Video, which is kind of like an online, I don't know really what to liken it to, but it's pretty snazzy. It's where the parties can see each other through these screens and communicate, that type of deal. Basically, the therapist is the person that kind of takes the lead on those deals. More often than not, the guidance counselor or Title I teacher will attend those if we can arrange that. But transfer of records, that's usually happened well in advance of the kid leaving, even before they leave our facility. So, if, like I said, it's usually been a couple days, maybe a week turnaround when the kid's registered. We then do post-release checks for Title I Part D and making certain that the kids are there as well. So I like to think it's more of a smooth process. And I think in the past at one time maybe that wasn't quite the case, but it has been that it has improved considerably.
And also probation, we're required to either through video, like Scott had mentioned, or in person, or sometimes even by phone if we're not able to set one of those two things up, family team meeting every month. So that would include the probation officer, the youth counselor that's working at the facility, the family, and the youth, and to start to address those highlighted areas of what needs to happen, what can we start planning on now, and what needs to happen when the youth is ready to return to the community. And we actually have a document that we're required to fill out, and that gets presented. So Scott had talked a little bit about the 60-day notice. When that 60-day notice goes out, 30 days from that 60-day notice, a court hearing, or what we call a reentry hearing, normally takes place, and we're required to present a document called the Individualized Reentry Plan that spells out for the court what each of those key areas is going to look like, what's the living situation going to look like, what's the safety plan going to look like for the youth and the family when they get back, but more importantly for this conversation is what's education going to look like, and where is the youth going to go to school, and what are the classes when they return supposed to look like. Along with the individualized reentry plan, there's a document that it's the education court report, which we're required to fill out with the assistance of the facility, and present that to the judge as well during that 30-day that reentry hearing that takes place 30 days before the youth returns to the community.
Finally, Mark, it sounds like the new role for probation staff allows for more follow-up with youth after they leave facilities.
When youth leave the YRTCs, our probation officers have pretty regular contact with they and the family, and then it's not, let's say the youth is doing really well, the soonest that youth would come off of probation coming out of facility would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 or 5 months. So there's some follow along there to working with the probation officer.
So, Randy and Dave, I'm imagining things are a little different for your facilities because they are detention centers. What does transition and reentry look like for you all since you do have the youth for shorter periods of time?
We've been actively involved in transition planning for a number of years here. We employ a full-time transition coordinator, and he starts working with kids on their exit from the facility from the day they enter, and he'll meet with them here, start talking about what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, what their expected length of stay is. He attends a weekly detention review hearing or meeting where he gets information on what the current status is on all of our students, and then keeps them updated. He'll provide them with information about where they're going. If they're looking at a particular facility, he can give them the information they really want to know, like what kind of clothes are they going to wear, what's the food like, when can they have a visitor, and then try and connect them with a specific individual at that facility. Now, if they go back to the school district directly, He will follow up with them right away, and he will be in contact with the schools with any specific information we might need to provide them beyond the regular educational information. But if we know something unique, he'll be the contact person and has contacts all over the district and with surrounding schools. He then follows up with them, and it's on an individual basis of need. Some kids will go back to school and just want to forget they were ever here and don't need any help, and they'll be fine. Whereas some kids may need a lot more assistance, in which case he plays it on a case-by-case basis. We also provide a little specialized tutoring, individualized tutoring. If a student gets back to school, they're struggling and they're not willing to work with anyone else in that building, and they have a relationship with one of our particularly well-liked teachers, that teacher is willing to do some tutoring with them at school, and so we will provide that on an as-needed basis. And then the district also has a half-time person that we pay through Title I who looks at the longer-term students that may have gone to, say, for example, Geneva and been there for an extended period of time, and then they show up back in the district. We have a person whose responsibility is to watch for those students and make sure that their integration back into the district goes smoothly, because they know we've got information here at the detention center about them, and we can help with that process. So it's a coordinated effort. A lot of our high schools here have transition teams as well that are not part of our program, but are separate groups of teachers and administrators and other individuals that are willing to provide support for kids that are coming back from out-of-home placements. And so there's a pretty broad web that gets thrown out there. Do we catch every one of them in the right way every time? Probably not. But do we catch the vast majority of them with a wide array of services that can be individualized for their need? That's really what's proven to us to be the most successful. So it's a continuum of service. It starts from the moment they walk in the door until we see them successfully reintegrated.
The only thing that I would add to that is we just make a lot of phone calls and contacts to make sure that the transition process does go smoothly. We follow up a lot, make sure that credits earned in our facility make it onto homeschool transcripts, and a lot of emails, a lot of phone calls to assist in transition. So
I absolutely agree with that. That's always the key, is making sure that information gets passed along. And there's such an array of services available, and coordinating those things together. Our transition coordinator, we don't try and provide all of these services. We try and find those people that are out there and have relationships with them. We work really well with the probation staff, and so we know, are they in contact with them? Is there something we can do? Are they, who's successful and who's waiting in the wings to step in when something isn't working? And that tends to create a much stronger network than to just say, well, it's this person's responsibility or that person's responsibility.
Well, in many ways, we've just scratched the surface on this issue, but that seems like a great place for us to leave it for today. Gene, Pat, Scott, Randy, Dave, and Mark, I want to thank you all for taking the time to speak with us today. You've certainly shown that Nebraska is committed to meeting the needs of youth with disabilities in secure care settings, and your coordinated ways of doing so certainly exemplify the practices highlighted in the IDEA Dear Colleague letter. I know most of you are sticking around to answer some questions, but thank you all again for sharing with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for having us on board.
Our guest from Nebraska shared some examples indicative of many great efforts around the country to address the educational and related needs of youth with disabilities who are educated in secure care facilities. Nebraska understands this population and their unique needs, and they both have a long history of serving these youth, as well as have adapted over the years to provide the best quality education and care for them. We hope their work, as well as the information from Assistant Secretary Uden and Professor Gagnon on the importance of meeting the needs of this vulnerable population, encourage you to continue the great work in your area for these youth. NDTAC and the Office of Safe and Healthy Students at the U.S. Department of Education will continue our partnership with ED's Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, as well as with experts around the country to assist state agencies, school districts, and facilities in providing high-quality general and special education services to youth in need. We hope you'll continue to join us in this work. Before we turn to your questions and comments, I want to acknowledge another individual from Nebraska who helped make today's conversation possible. Michelle Borg is a consultant for the Commissioner of Education in Nebraska, and she oversees the education of all system-involved students, including those involved with the juvenile justice and child welfare systems. In a previous conversation, Michelle talked with us about the state's overall approach to meeting the educational and related needs of these students, including those with disabilities. We'll have a recording of that conversation up on our website in coming days and encourage you to give it a listen. We greatly appreciate Michelle taking the time to speak with us and for helping connect the great work we heard about today. And speaking of the website, a full recording of today's program will be posted shortly on the site, on the event page linked on our homepage at www.neglected-delinquent.org. Also on that page, you'll find many great resources from NDTAC, the U.S. Department of Education, and from Nebraska related to today's topic. There's also a link to the archive of our last N&D InFocus event focused on the Correctional Education Package. We hope you'll take some time to explore these archives and to pass them along to your colleagues. And now, we'd love to hear from you with your questions and comments about today's program.